Dear friends, it is a pleasure for me to welcome you to another edition of the new Forum 2000 series, Forum 2000 online chat. This is a project where we focus on holding interviews with interesting and important people from the Forum 2000 networks, activists, analysts, politicians from around the world, discussing the current situation connected to the global pandemics, and mainly its impact on our societies and on democracy and freedom around the world. So to discuss these issues, it is my great pleasure today to welcome with us Amichai Magen, a friend, a senior lecturer at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Interdisciplinary Centre in Herzliya, Israel. Together we will discuss how the pandemics is affecting Israel, but mainly we will look at the issues where Amichai has been focusing his attention in his research, which is the global liberal order and the consequences of this pandemics on this global liberal order. So Amichai, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Jakub, and thank you for hosting me. And I hope you and your loved ones are all healthy and well. I know the Czech Republic is a leader in effective social distancing, and you've been managing to keep infection rates very, very low. So I'm very, very glad and proud of the Czech people in this regard as well as in many others.
Thank you, Amichai, and likewise the same to you and to Israeli people. And starting with that, Israel was one of the countries that was, I think, quickest and most resolute in adopting some of the measures that we are now seeing around the world. Can you please maybe briefly describe to us how this is being done and how this is impacting on the society, but mostly how is it impacting politics in Israel, and what may be the longer term consequences of this?
Okay, so there's a lot there, Jakub. I think that what we see emerging around the world are three basic strategies for dealing with the pandemic. I would call the first one denial. I think we saw that in the United Kingdom in the early stages of this pandemic, although the United Kingdom has reversed course. We see an element of denial in places like Sweden, that sort of let this go. So this is one strategy. The second strategy, I would call it the smart, high-tech, intrusive strategy. And that's a strategy we saw practiced very effectively in Singapore and South Korea, where essentially you use very intrusive technological surveillance to identify people who carry the disease and potentially people who have been exposed to them. You use surveillance cameras, you use social network surveillance, you use cell phone surveillance to really pinpoint sources of infection and to very quickly. And then there's the third strategy, I think is common to most Western democracies, which is the social distancing and quarantine and the sort of radical reduction in economic and social activity, which we see in the United States and all across Europe. And I think Israel falls into that last third category, like many other Western democracies. I think that in the early stages of the pandemic, we had a window of opportunity to follow the South Korean model, but we kind of missed it. I think many Western democracies missed that model. The reason why we missed it, I think, is twofold. One is that we don't have the experience of South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore in dealing with the SARS epidemic. So there's several countries in Southeast Asia that have perfected their methods over the last few years because they have dealt with the SARS epidemic. Countries in Europe and the United States, we haven't had that recent experience. I think also that there was some degree of misunderstanding about the consequences of the fact that this is an exponentially spreading virus. And so it's very difficult to get people to be frightened when there are 10 or 20 cases. But that's not the point. The point is by the time you have 10 or 20 cases, your infection rates are actually much higher, and then the numbers grow very quickly. So I think Israel kind of fell into that third category, a little bit complacent. But then you are right. We clamped down very quickly. And we are continuing to clamp down very quickly. In fact, today at 3 p.m., we're going to go into a national lockdown for the Passover holiday for a 3-day period. And so there are draconian freedom of movement restrictions, draconian restrictions on meetings, on gatherings, and quite strong enforcement. You're going to see a lot of police in the street. In some Israeli cities, especially where you have a large ultra-Orthodox community, the military has been brought in to create a cordon sanitaire around certain areas where levels of infections are high. So Israel has moved relatively quickly, but has used kind of dumb social distancing mechanisms rather than very sophisticated technology-driven mechanisms, although those are being introduced gradually as well. In terms of the effect on politics,
yes, please go ahead.
Jacob, shall I continue? In terms of the effects of politics, I think again we have in the Israeli case a very interesting example of the sort of unintended consequences and effects of this type of exogenous shock. And I think I will start with the general point about the relationship between the pandemic and democracy, and then illustrate it with reference to Israel. I think that what we are seeing now in the broadly democratic world is that within the democratic world, we see a kind of a split between two types of democratic realities. I think that there is one group of countries that would include a lot of the Scandinavian countries, Germany, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, high quality liberal democracies where level of public trust is high and where you don't have leaders with populist or authoritarian tendencies. And I think those systems are weathering the storm quite well in the sense that their political systems, their political regimes are not really being undermined by the pandemic. And I think we need to contrast this with other democratic states. I would put the United States very much in that category. I would put Italy in that category. I would put Israel in that category. I'm not referring here to Hungary, but it's a spectrum. I think we can definitely see examples of what I'm about to describe happening in Chile, happening in Poland at the moment. These are democracies that entered the pandemic with substantial questions about legitimacy, about trust in democratic institutions and procedures. And what we see happening is that the pandemic is exacerbating those divisions and those suspicions where the cracks were already there before the pandemic struck. So the COVID-19 pandemic is really acting as a catalyst and as an accelerator for processes of democratic backsliding and democratic hollowing in a way that perhaps would have happened anyway, but probably over a longer period of time. We see the virus accelerating processes of democratic hollowing and backsliding. And in the case of Hungary and potentially Poland now as well, I would say even a democratic breakdown. Now, where does Israel fall into this? As you know, Jakub, we went through 3 national elections over the past year, and our our political elites were desperate to avoid a 4th national elections. I think that there was a deep understanding that we could not afford it economically, but more importantly, we could not afford it if we want to preserve the relevance and the legitimacy of our national elections. So there was tremendous pressure even before the pandemic struck to form a national government and to avoid a 4th round of elections. But we also entered this situation with a prime minister who's under indictment for 3 very serious offenses. And so we entered the pandemic crisis in a situation of political instability, in a situation where trust in the political elites and the political system was already not at its highest, and where there was already fairly low trust in the motives of the prime minister, of Benjamin Netanyahu, and a sense that he would essentially do anything to avoid facing trial and potentially being found guilty of very serious offenses and having to spend jail time. So we entered the crisis already at a moment of political uncertainty and low trust and a relatively low sense of legitimacy for the Israeli political system. And what the pandemic has managed to do is to essentially allow Benjamin Netanyahu to escape what seemed like an almost impossible political situation for him. He is, this was the deus ex machina of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Do you think this will have a sort of a longer term impact on the quality of Israeli democracy and on Israeli politics after we see the end of the pandemics?
Well, Jakub, I don't know, and I think it's very difficult to tell because we don't know how long this is going to last, and we don't know what the counter reaction will be. In the short run, I think we're seeing several very worrying trends. Number one is and again, these are relevant not just for Israel but for other democracies around the world. Number one is the evaporation of public attention away from these kinds of questions of the quality of democracy and constitutionalism and the normative standards of our public life. When this type of exogenous shock happens, people tend to be very focused on their own personal health, on their family, on their day-to-day economic survival, and that takes the public eyes away from the political arena and the constitutional questions, and it creates, again, windows of opportunity that can be readily exploited by leaders who already perhaps have some populist or authoritarian tendencies. So I think this is one effect. The public cannot go out to demonstrate because of social distancing rules. Having online, Zoom demonstrations is not the same as filling, the central squares and streets of your capital city. So there is this limitation, and public attention is focused on the here and now, and that creates an opening for skilled politicians to change the political agenda, perhaps irrevocably. And we see this in Hungary. We see the way in which Viktor Orban has used this crisis to do what he's been planning to do probably for some time, but was restricted. So there is a kind of window of, I would describe it as a window of authoritarian opportunity, where democracies that already have leaders with populist and authoritarian tendencies can take advantage of the crisis. So this is one thing to watch. The second thing to watch is the use of highly intrusive surveillance technologies by the state. So this is no longer by Google or Apple or Facebook. This is surveillance technology by the state that in the Israeli case, but not only in the Israeli case, is being moved from the realm of counterterrorism and the realm of fighting money laundering and organized crime, mechanisms that are usually reserved for very extreme situations are being adapted and applied to the entire population. Now, I think history teaches us that once this transition happens, and once we accept as null the fact that the government will survey us and our phones and our social interactions in real time on a massive ongoing scale, it is almost impossible to roll this back after the crisis moment is over. So I think that many of our societies, once the coronavirus crisis is over, will find that the rules of the game in terms of state surveillance of social media and cell phones and all of that has been radically extended. And it's very unlikely that this will be rolled back. I think one of the things we need to insist upon after the crisis is a number of rollback mechanisms. We need to have a discussion about how to roll back these highly intrusive mechanisms of surveillance. Because we don't, they will very quickly become normalized. And they could easily be extended in the next phase to identifying political opposition, to intimidating people, to finding sorts of embarrassing things about people. And this could very easily be turned into a tool for damping down criticism and dissent and potentially political opposition. So this is something that I worry about. The other thing that I deeply worry about is the disintegration of the European Union. I think that the European Union now is reeling. The European Union entered this crisis already in quite a fragile, battered state. But there are two things happening now within the European Union that I think are extremely dangerous. One is the sense that people have in Italy and in Spain in particular, but I think we could also see this manifesting itself in France and elsewhere in the European Union, the sense that the notion of solidarity among European Union member states is an empty promise and a facade. I think that a situation in which it is China that is sending emergency medical equipment to Italy before France and Germany and the Czech Republic or Holland is doing this tells us something about the state of the European Union. And of course, the second crisis that is here with us is that following Viktor Orban's announcement last week that, and not just announcement, but a parliamentary validation that he will rule Hungary essentially by decree for an indefinite period of time with no parliamentary supervision, with no real judicial supervision, with draconian rules on the media, etc., etc. We now have in the European Union an openly authoritarian member state. That is the reality. And so far, the European Union has done very, very little to curtail Hungary's authoritarian tendencies. Some would argue that the European Union, in a way, is facilitating the continued rule of Viktor Orban as a dictator in Hungary. So I think this is a mortal danger to the European Union. I think that we really are in critical weeks and months that will determine whether the European Union continues to exist as a community of democracies. And I think that it can only exist as a community of democracies. If the European Union is not a community of democracies, it will not survive for long. It will fragment.
Just to complement on that, I think you're right on the European Union. This is something that we all are very much concerned, or many of us are very much concerned about the future of the EU, the way how EU has been fairly slow in responding. On the other hand, I think what we now see is somehow EU coming back a little bit, adopting measures, starting to deal with the economic consequences, which will be dramatic of this crisis. We also see some belated, but still reemergence of European solidarity, and also we see definitely as details are coming out, realization of, for example, you mentioned the China aid, that the aid was often not as much aid as a sale, and often a sale of inferior product, which is now coming to light. So I think we are definitely, the picture is more complicated, but I completely agree with you that EU is one of the points that we will need to focus on a lot as we proceed. But yes, you hinted on it to yourself. We would now move to the global picture and to the how this current situation may affect the future of the global liberal order, because what we now see is this lack of solidarity, not just on the EU level, but on the global level. We see that there is not, or there does not seem to be, a global coordinated response to the pandemics. The WHO's role is questioned, and indeed it's quite questionable often. So what do you think will be the consequences, and do you think that this kind of crisis is showing that there is at the moment not much of an actual international liberal rules-based order functioning?
Yeah, so I think like the category of democracies that we spoke about before, the democracies that entered this crisis already in a weak state, we could apply similar analogy to the liberal international order. I mean, the liberal international order was already suffering from a number of very, very serious shortcomings and difficulties before the pandemic struck. And the pandemic has acted as an accelerator and as a catalyst for many of these pre-existing conditions. But if we think about the liberal international order as essentially being built on three main principles, the first is global economic openness. The second is a certain faith in the superiority of liberal democracy and liberal political systems over authoritarian systems. And thirdly, a sort of an American underwritten rules-based international order. All those three pillars of the liberal international order have, at least in the short run, I want to emphasize that in the short run, have been hit very, very badly by this pandemic. So the short-term effects are less faith in multilateralism, less faith in the superiority of open democratic systems, and less faith in the usefulness of multilateralism and of economic openness. So there's no doubt that in the short term, I think that the existing world order has taken another big blow. The question is how we respond to it. You know, tragedy and exogenous shocks of this type, we know from history, can either be missed and allowed to bring down an existing order. This is what we saw in the world in the 1930s. But there are other examples. There are examples where tragedy and shock spurs us to new creativity, and it creates a window of opportunity for rejuvenation and for new ideas. The missing variable is can be summarized in one word, and that word is leadership. The word is leadership. And again, I wish, I hope I'm wrong, but I think that at the moment we have leadership, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe and elsewhere in the democratic world, that doesn't inspire us with a lot of confidence that something constructive can come out of this. Now, history also teaches us that these types of processes can take years and sometimes decades to materialize. But at the moment, I think we don't have a lot of room for short-term optimism. But having said that, I think it is absolutely incumbent upon us, upon people in the Forum 2000 network, to utilize this time of emergency to the best effect that we can. We need to think both in terms of short-term protections for our democratic systems. I mentioned the idea of rollback mechanisms. We need to think about how we roll back the damage, the short-term damage that has been done to our democracies, to public faith in our institutions, to the extent that has happened in the short run. And in the longer run, we need to find liberal solutions to the core problems of humanity, whether it's climate change or anxiety about technology and AI, or whether it is about pandemics. This was not a black swan event. This was not something that happened, that came out of the blue. This is what some scholars describe as a great event. This is something that we knew was coming, and we didn't know exactly when it was going to hit, but we knew it was going to happen. And yet, as we see in many of our societies, we are ill prepared. So that will inevitably cause a short-term or even a medium-term decline in public trust in institutions and in democratic politics, and we need to work very hard to rebuild that trust and to restore it. I think the only way we can do that is by strengthening our commitment to open, fair, responsible democratic leadership, but also beginning to show that, and to contest and to show that we can find democratic liberal solutions to the core problem. If we don't do that, then the balance of people's faith between democracies and authoritarian regimes is going to shift further in the wrong directions. So we are now being tested, and we need to work very energetically to make sure that that we contest and we win this competition, because if we don't, then the future could be very bleak in that regard.
Thank you, Amichai. I think that was very good to conclude. It's indeed a very strong test for all of us, and we need to use it in the way that brings out new ideas, rejuvenate some of the important elements in liberal democratic thinking, and not to allow this to take away our freedoms. So thank you, Amichai. Thank you very much for that. All the best to you, your family, and friends in Israel. And let's hope that we will get out of this situation as soon as possible, and we'll again be able to resume our common work.
Yes, and let's hope that we are able to meet in beautiful Prague in the beginning of October. And if not in October, then God willing, very, very soon.
I'm looking forward to it. Take care and thank you.